talk a little bit about XERC20. It's an EIP that we put forward to fix bridges. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what Connext is, since I'm not sure everybody else has context on what we do. Go into why the bridge, especially token bridge space, is really fucked right now. And then talk through the design space for what a solution looks like and what that solution then can unlock. So who is Connext? We are a R&D organization turned into a protocol that's been building in this space for a very long time. We started building things on top of Ethereum in 2017. Initially focused around Ethereum scalability. We actually built one of the first L2s on Ethereum. It was a payment channel network designed to do micropayments, largely used at the time by a very, very early project called SpankChain, which is pretty much exactly what we think it is. In 2020, we spent a bunch of time working with other layer 2 research teams, folks like the Matic team, Polygon, the Plasma Group team that eventually became Optimism. And we realized that there's this really interesting trend that was happening where there were these extremely strong, very, very knowledgeable teams building rollups. And we saw that there's just like a growing ecosystem of rollups that had strong VC backing, strong product market fit coming out of the woodwork in like mid to late 2020. And we also realized there was this secondary problem that was going to get created, which is that unlike most people at the time, we realized that there was very unlikely that there was going to be any single rollup that actually won. And that in order for rollups and other chains and layer 2 in general to actually be usable, we would need to figure out a way to be able to get assets and data between rollups and between LPs. And so this was something that we kind of started playing around with in mid-2020 and then realized and built a product for. Didn't realize just how incredibly big this problem would become and how quickly it would become a big problem, because in late 2020, early 2021, that was right when the multi-chain world started taking off. We went from everybody saying there's going to be one winning L2 to all of a sudden just about every project in the space announcing a multi-chain strategy in, I think it was like less than 2 months. It was kind of crazy. Since then, we've been focused on trying to figure out the holy grail of what interoperability looks like, which is how you build the ability to have communication between chains that doesn't actually need to rely on an external set of actors, whether that's another chain or a multi-sig or something like that. And really the answer to that is to be able to rely on existing infrastructure as much as possible. So the existing kind of roll-up and canonical bridges that we already use, that already form the basis of our security within the space. And I'll get into what that means a little bit more here. So one thing that we've kind of realized as a result of just working in this space for a very long time is that similar to blockchains themselves, bridging has a stack. There's a set of items that just about every bridge does. Either they do all of them directly or they outsource some of the pieces. And modularizing that stack, so specializing different projects is focused onto specific parts of this problem rather than the entire problem, seems to be similar to the blockchain themselves, seems to be how we actually get the best set of trade-offs. And so what are these pieces today? These pieces are transport. So this is the very, very simple problem of how do you even relay data from one chain to another. Everyone kind of does this. Everybody has had to do this themselves and build a protocol for this themselves. But there are some well-specified protocols. So IBC in the Cosmos world is a transport protocol. It's kind of the base layer protocol on top of which you can have all of these other pieces. But IBC is just a very, very sophisticated, well-defined way for two blockchains to do the most minimal form of communication, not necessarily taking security into account. Now, of course, IBC only works for Cosmos, and other kinds of bridges only really work if there's some security mechanism. You need some. You can't necessarily just trust that a relayer or some actor, usually it's just a single server that's taking data from one chain to another is doing so honestly. And so the security mechanism that's built on top of the system is fundamentally what ensures that your bridge isn't just going to get hacked for billions of dollars like has happened over the last few years. So how does security happen? There's a bunch of different approaches. Like I said, multi-sigs. A lot of the work is now shifting to light clients. This is kind of what secure bridges are. And then rollups themselves, rollup bridges themselves are their own form of security mechanism here. Above this are the kind of pieces that we focus on as Connext. We think that these are the pieces that are a little less well understood at the moment, but they also represent a much bigger opportunity. And for us, as an organization that's been very kind of interested in making this seamless and possible for users, we think the top level of the stack, which is the piece around intents, is probably what's most interesting. Intents, I'm sure everyone here has heard about intents now. Intents are a way for us to describe a type of activity that bridges have been doing actually since like 2010, which is allowing for external parties, in the case of intents, it's intent pillars, or Connext, we call them routers, they're atomic swap protocols, we call them LPs, but allowing some external set of actors to fulfill transactions for users on their behalf. So basically, if you want to swap USDC for ETH on another chain, you could bridge the USDC yourself and swap it, or you can just pay somebody to do it for you and give you the ETH. That's effectively what an intent accomplishes. And so how does this work in Connext? Next, like I mentioned earlier, we try to find ways to rely to not do the security and transport pieces, because we think that there's already enough infrastructure out there that does this in a very safe way. And we think that other projects, especially things like Layer 0, Axel, etc., that bring their own security models, that fundamentally introduces a trust assumption against just interacting with the roll-up. So what we do is we actually send messages through the roll-up bridges. Every time a user makes a transaction, so say, we go back to the example that I gave earlier, user wants to, you have 100 USDC on Polygon, and you want to make a swap into ETH on Optimism. What happens in Connext when a user defines this is that pretty much immediately we have an off-chain network of routers that do the swap on behalf of the user. So they just give the user $100 worth of ETH. And then in the background, that router's kind of out of pocket now. They've effectively loaned money to the user. In the background, there's this process where we actually send messages back to the authentic roots, send them down to Ethereum through the roll-up bridges and the canonical bridges, merge all of those state roots into one combined global root, basically one root of all rollups, and then bring that root back out of the rollup. And using that root, have the router prove that they did actually correctly front capital and get repaid by the protocol. All right, switching gears a little bit. So we talked a little bit about this token bridging model. This is a really, really interesting model. It's something that a lot of projects have been looking into. This is how Cross works, for example. This is how Pop works. This is how Uniswap X kind of works, except Uniswap X goes in this direction instead of this direction for their settlement. That's the only difference. But it isn't really the perfect solution. And this is kind of where we get into some of the nitty-gritty details of why token bridging kind of sucks. So let's start with the absolute basics. What does it mean to bridge a token? It turns out even this is actually a little bit of a complicated question, because a lot of times when you tell people, oh, I want to bridge a token, they're thinking, I'm bridging to Optimism, there's already USDC on Optimism, I just want to make sure I get the right version of USDC on Optimism. But the answer to this question is also completely different when you have a totally new chain that doesn't even have USDC on it in the first place. And so the first premise that we kind of have to start with, which is a little bit basic, right, is if you want to bridge a token, you have to have a representation of that token on the destination chain. If you want to bring USDC to XYZ chain, you have to deploy a USDC contract on XYZ chain. Somewhat basic. The question is, who deploys that contract and who owns it? Right now, typically, it's deployed, the token is minted by the canonical bridge of that chain. But canonical bridges have trade-offs, right? We know that all the roll-up bridges are slow and expensive. They only connect to Ethereum. Most canonical bridges out there really only connect to Ethereum. They're not available on every chain. So a lot of chains, like Bluebeam, for example, doesn't even have a canonical bridge. And so whose version of the token is actually correct in that case? And so if you're a token issuer, you're kind of left with a couple of sort of shitty options. You either work with a single provider. You work with something like Layer 0 FTs, with multi-chain, with there's been so many instances of this. You just create your own proprietary version of the token, and you only work with that single bridge forever on every chain. This is fantastic for a lot of reasons. You don't need liquidity at all. There's no slippage in your transactions. You're just minting and burning the token across chains. You can go wherever that bridge goes. But it has trade-offs. The big trade-off is that now you're pretty much just fully locked into that bridge forever. If that bridge gets hacked, there's really nothing you can do. And this is kind of what happened with multi-chain a couple of months ago. There's hundreds, thousands actually of tokens deployed on multi-chain bridge across chains. When multi-chain got exploited, there was really no way for any of those tokens to remove themselves from that situation. Most of them had to either freeze, the supply of their tokens that was on another chain where it was like multi-chain minted, and then pretty much just redeploy their tokens from scratch. That's obviously a nightmare. We were working with BP Finance, for example. BP encountered this really, really ridiculous problem where they're like, okay, well we'll just redeploy the BP token on every chain that's minted by multi-chain, and then they realized no, BP is actually being used as collateral in a bunch of liquidity pools. So there's no way to replace the BP that was used in those liquidity pools without getting users to go and pull all of the liquidity out, and then so it's just a kind of a ridiculous situation. And this core problem is why we have really awful things like the Harmony bridge hack, the Nomad bridge hack, the Wormhole bridge hack. This is the kind of root of that, where there's systemic risk introduced by a single bridge. So then you have option number 2. This is really the one that most people go with. The project doesn't really endorse any option. They just say, okay, you know what, we're just gonna let it be a bit of a free for all. For L2s, most of the time, because there is a canonical bridge, it's pretty easy for people. Users will just sort of collectively agree that the canonical bridge minted token is the canonical one. And so in that case, every bridge then needs to go and build liquidity for the canonical bridge token. You can no longer transfer, whatever assets, a BP token, for example, from ETH to Optimism without fees. You now need to transfer it from ETH to Optimism, and you need to build a liquidity pool of BP. And because you have a liquidity pool of BP, you now need to have slippage and all the other things that come with having liquidity pools. This, of course, for most projects, can get really prohibitive. So every single bridge, every single chain you add, you now need to incentivize. And so for most long-tail tokens, that's super expensive. And that problem only gets worse, right? We're all talking about moving towards a world with potentially thousands of rollups. How do you go and incentivize liquidity on multiple bridges on thousands of rollups? You just don't. It's going to cost you millions and millions of dollars. Alternatively, this is kind of what happened in the Moonbeam case, which is really, really unfortunate, is if you don't actually endorse any option whatsoever, then you end up with a true free-for-all, where there's no canonical bridge, there's no official token that everybody colloquially agrees is the right flavor, and so you end up with 5 or 6 different representations of the same asset. This exists today in Osmosis, for example, the Cosmos ecosystem, where this is just Cosmos is just not at all solved this problem, and so there's 10 plus different flavors of USDC on Osmosis. And you have to swap between all of them to get to the right one in order to use it in an app. That's fucking insane. I don't understand how anyone would ever expect a user to understand that problem. It's users already have such a hard time understanding the difference between different chains and the difference between stablecoins. So giving them the difference between different flavors dependent on a chain of the same stablecoin is absolutely ridiculous. XERC20, as an open standard, tries to fix this on our app. How does it do that? Well, what we tried to do when thinking through the design of tokens and going across chains was we worked from ground zero on okay, what should this experience really look like, right? When you send a token across chains, you should always get the canonical version of the token. So you should always get the version of the token that the team, the token issuer, agrees is the right version of the token. Basically, no wrapped assets. Bridges should not need to bootstrap liquidity for each chain asset. Doing that just heavily favors bridges that have lots of capital. It heavily favors only tokens that are really larger cap blue chip tokens. For anybody that's longer tail, you kind of end up screwed, and you have to pay a huge ongoing fee to be able to add new chains. Cross-chain token interactions, similar, following on tube, should just be slippage free. It shouldn't be the case that you have to, incur potentially extremely high slippage when transferring between chains. We want to move towards a world where that just doesn't need to exist anymore. And then lastly, it really should be up to the token issuer to decide what bridges they want to support. They really the token issuer, the person who deploys the token. So for example, Maker should be the one that should decide what version of DAI is correct. What bridges should be able to interact with DAI? What are the security considerations associated with DAI? And that makes sense, right, fundamentally. Like your DAO, it's like bizarre for DAO governance to deploy a token to Optimism and have that token fully be owned by the Optimism bridge and not have any way to actually remove it from the Optimism bridge. So how does the approach work? At a very simple level, we started with, like, honestly fairly basic core principles. We're like, well, why don't we just allow for multiple people to be able to mint the same token implementation? So, the token issuer, say Maker, deploys DAI on Optimism, and they just, within the token contract itself, allow for multiple bridges to be able to mint and burn DAI. Fairly simple model and thought process. There's actually supposed to be an animation there, but you can. The animation shows the token going in here and it mints the same token coming out. The goal with this is the core idea behind this is quite simple, right? If everybody's minting the same token, you don't have any more verification. Now, in practice, that's also quite risky to do. Like, if everybody's minting the same token, any single bridge getting hacked means the entire token supply gets hacked. And so to account for that, what we did was also set up minting and burning limits, basically rate limits and caps. And the idea here is to, at least at a high level, map to the exact same security surface area that exists today. So, like, you put $100,000 into a liquidity pool of DAI, that is the total amount at risk in the event that the bridge gets hacked. That is functionally equivalent to setting a minting cap for a certain amount of time of 100,000 DAI, functionally. But as it turns out, that's actually not the only one that exists. And this is the kind of like more deep-seated, a little bit more subtle issue that underpins liquidity fragmentation. And really, like, apart from these three properties, this is really the only other thing that's needed in order to solve this problem. It's kind of simple and elegant. So what is this problem? The core problem here is that liquidity fragmentation actually doesn't happen on L2, it happens on L1. When you say today, for example, you have a token contract that, like the DAI example that I gave earlier. Maker allows DAI to be minted by Connext, they allow it to be minted by Layer 0, and they allow it to be minted by the Optimism canonical bridge. Doing that is actually not enough to ensure that DAI remains unfragmented. And the reason for that is, say, I send 100 DAI through the Optimism canonical bridge, send 100 DAI through Connext, and 100 through Layer 0. On Optimism, you get 300 of the same DAI. But if a user tries to transfer that 300 DAI back through any single pathway, they won't be able to. Why? Because there would be 100 DAI locked on the Optimism bridge, 100 on the Connext bridge, and 100 on the Layer 0 bridge, I guess. And that's really the root of all this, is that, like, L1 liquidity fragmentation means that you have to have multiple representations of mass on L2. So instead, we do something really, really stupid and kind of simple, and it actually really works well. We put the tokens into what we call a lockbox. It's like a shared place for tokens across all chains and all bridges for any single token to be consolidated. And then that lockbox mints the XERC20 representation of the token, and then mints and burns it across chains. So there's no tokens locked anywhere anymore. All of the tokens are in the lockbox. Now, what is the lockbox in practice? It's literally just the wet contract. You don't really need to do anything else. You just have to wrap this, and you have to make sure all the liquidity is in one spot. Fundamentally, if you think about it, why does this exist? This needs to exist because when designing ERC20, we didn't think about designing it in a way where it needed to scale to multiple chains, right? The ERC20 design doesn't have burn and mint within it. And so our conception of what it means to create a representation of an ERC20 on another chain has always been, okay, you have to put it somewhere and then create a wrapper of it. But that fundamentally, it doesn't, I don't know how many people here it does, but if you think about what's happening in the ERC20 contract, right, it's an address to balance mapping. Fundamentally, it doesn't matter if you're setting that address to the contract, like a specific contract, or to 0x0, fundamentally. So how does this work against other approaches? So one of the big things that we've talked about in this talk is, like, this is an open standard that tries to solve some of the problems with, like, more proprietary locking-based approaches. And I think that is really the fundamental difference here, is that, like, you still get the benefits of bridging a token in a mint and burn capacity without liquidity pools, which is, like, you can expand it to as many chains as you want, you can bridge without any fees, you have no slippage, you have perfect You can build all sorts of really amazing things on top of it, but then you get the side benefits of like, as a token issuer, you're sovereign. You can choose which bridges to support. You can like whitelist multiple bridges if you want. And if something goes wrong, you can de-whitelist bridges. And I think that optionality to say, oh, over the course of 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, we can change our minds, means that we're now open. We're basically changing the incentive structure of the space, right? Instead of projects optimizing to lock in tokens today because they know that they'll be locked in effectively forever, instead now you are incentivized to continually improve your product. You're incentivized to continually work towards building better security models because the best security mechanisms, the best kinds of bridges, don't exist yet. Right? They're still being built. It will take years for shared sequencing, things like that to come online. And then of course the last piece is the rate limits. The more granular control over security. Being able to define this is the maximum amount of risk I am comfortable with for this specific bridge or for a given chain. I think one of the biggest and most interesting things about this is that XERC20 was sort of conceptualized by Connext, and we put out the IP initially. But we're seeing that this is such a interesting and generally neutral standard that we've seen a wider adoption from it, even from some of our competitors. And I think that that's just one of the best indicators that this is a real problem that needs to be solved in the space, and B, that this is a solution that is something that everyone can actually agree upon. By the way, getting people to agree upon things in the bridge space is extremely difficult. Everybody's super PvP. It's very, very hard. So I personally consider this a huge accomplishment. These screenshots are from, recently there was a bunch of controversy around the LIDA forums because there's zero bridged, an OOT version of wrap stake keys across chains without really getting permission. And there was just a lot of organic discussion that came around, well, why don't you just use a more mutual standard like XERC from? And so following that, we put out, along with a bunch of other bridges, a unified call for an open standard for this. And with a very specific goal of well, if we work together on it, the overall problem space becomes so much easier to solve and so much cheaper to solve that we don't all have to go and spend tons and tons of money bootstrapping liquidity. And of course, I think one of the most important things here is that similar to the core thesis of Connext, of canonical bridge maximalism, use the roll-up bridges wherever you can, try to trust the security inherent to layer 2s and not your own separate security. This standard and this approach is compatible with that mental model, right? You can minimize the risk that comes from other kinds of security mechanisms, and as a token issuer, make it so that the vast majority of your token bridging is coming from the canonical bridge or coming from mechanisms that rely on it only. As just an example of this, there's a bunch of different ecosystems that are now building this into the canonical bridges. One that is live already is Altair. So Altair, for all of their rollups, built honestly, pretty incredible that they did this. They built a whole UI-driven flow for being able to set up XERC20 support on your rollup, set up XERC20 compatible bridges, and then deploy XERC20 tokens, manage them, manage their rate limits, etc. I think this kind of tooling is really what it takes to get to the point where this becomes ubiquitous. And yeah, I mean, we're already talking with a lot of other ecosystems about something similar. So we expect that the canonical bridges of most rollups and chains will eventually support some flavor of this standard. And then lastly, I want to touch on what does this actually imply? So why is this important? I think bridging overall is obviously a big problem, and I didn't spend too much time getting into that. I think there's a lot that I could probably talk about there. But I think even with token bridging very specifically, there's a bunch of blockers. Token bridging has just been a blocker for a bunch of things that we've been talking about for some time, but really, we don't have a practical way to make happen. One of the biggest ones is more rollups. When we talk to rollup as a service providers or when we talk to new rollup ecosystems, the biggest thing that they struggle with is bridge support, because it's just, you basically have to go and build liquidity for your rollup in order for anybody to come and use it. And you have to build that bridge liquidity even before you go and build DeFi, which is kind of insane. In my view, the whole goal behind the 1,000 rollup thesis is it should be like an Amazon server. It should be like an EC2. You should just be able to turn it on and it should come connected to the internet. When you were using an EC2, you had to go and then spend months building internet support for your server, you would never use it. And I think as an extension of that, this core argument also applies to application specific as well. So there's this whole thing around like, okay, when is Unichain going to happen? And the counter argument that I had at the time was like, well, at least with the way that the bridging world works today, in order for Unichain to work, you need bridges to come and build liquidity on all of the tokens on Unichain. And at that point, the bridges can actually just short circuit Uniswap. You don't need to even use the DEX. The bridges can just, through MEV, front run all of Uniswap's transactions, do the swaps on behalf of the user, collect all of the fees, and then Unichain just dies. That whole model just doesn't make sense unless you have something like this, unless you have this like seamless bridging. And then there's a couple of other pieces which are a little bit more new. One piece is chain abstraction. So this is something that we've been talking about at Connext for a little while. And this is a fairly simple idea of like users should just not need to know what chain they're on. Right now, if you are a user that's trying to interact with another chain, and even if you try to obfuscate that whole experience, if I'm like going back to the original example, if I'm a user that wants to like get the best possible ETH for USDC for ETH price, and I do a swap across chains on Optimism, there's still the thing that's still a little bit weird is that you get slippage on the bridge transaction in both directions. So the pricing for that is not as great as it would be. And as a user, that experience is still a little bit broken. Having a more seamless, more secure pathway to do token bridging means getting rid of that problem completely. It means potentially getting rid of the notion of we have many different chains and we need to think about them. And then lastly, for content systems like Connext, it means optimal pricing. So like systems like Connext, our costs are driven by the settlement layers that I talked about. If our settlement layers have the capacity to mint tokens for us across top, Axelar, etc., then we can provide the best possible pricing. That means like, transfers of stablecoins across chains with like 1 to 2 BPS fees. And that gets settled in like less than 20 seconds. That's what it takes to then get to like institutional level of capital. And yeah, that's about it. If you're interested in what we're doing, check out Connext. There's also a website, xrc20.com, if you're interested in the standard. And on the xrc20.com website, there's also a link to a builder's Telegram group, which is a cool place to get.
Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a second.
Oh, yeah. So I researched a lot of bridges as well. So today is the most effective bridge. It's not like a bridge, it's a trading platform, but cross-chain trading and messaging platform is the bridge, DLN.
Yeah, I talked about that earlier.
Have you heard about that?
Yeah.
It's not like a canonical bridge. It doesn't mean anything, block anything. It's just the takers and makers where you can deploy it like by yourself your own node and provide liquidity to the trade. So you can like swap your liquidity from Ethereum to Optimism, like to Solana, everywhere, and it will be like decentralized by the validators. And yeah, I mean, you're providing functionality like bridging by XRC20 token, right? I mean, for example, you're locking this token on the one chain, and you're burning in the one chain, and you're minting it in another chain, right? So, but here you need to provide a liquidity to this token, right?
No.
To liquidity pools. But how it will be valuable? How it will be swapped? Like, for example, I want to make to swap from Ethereum to Solana. How it will happen?
If you burn 1 ETH on Ethereum and then you mint 1 ETH on Solana, and you have a crypto economic guarantee that burning that ETH on Solana will mint another ETH on Ethereum, then
but
will have the same value.
Yeah, but who will own the contract on Solana of this ETH?
That is the whole point of this thing. So in the case of ETH, so I want to clarify by the way, like, this is explicitly for tokens that have a token issuer. Obviously, ETH doesn't count. I don't think Ethereum can be approached in this way. Because fundamentally, the goal behind the XRC20 model is like, you have a DAO or some sort of actor like Circle that is willing to say, I'm willing to understand the risks of a bunch of different bridging systems and like quantify that risk as a rate limit. For Ethereum, it's not really possible to do that. I mean, the only way that Ethereum could do that is if like the validators like basically fork the chain to come to consensus about what a rate limit should be.
Yeah, I mean, who can actually use this bridge? I mean, for example, I can reach XRC20 token, right? But how can I buy this token? Who will sell it to me? I mean, on the market, you provide liquidity
You
on
can
the
wrap
asset.
into it.
I can wrap into it,
Yeah.
but I need to wrap my Ethereum, right?
No, just, I mean, so, again, I wanna specify that, like, there's a difference between ETH as an asset here versus something like that, right? So you could wrap DAI into the next ERC20 version, bridge it across chain, so long as
Yeah.
Justice supports this.
Yeah.
You couldn't do it with ETH. But with DAI, there wouldn't need to be a liquidity provider or any purchase.
But it can be any list of assets that I can like wrap to XRC20.
Yeah.
But how will we define the price of this swap? For example, it can be USDT, right?
How do you define the price of wrapped ETH?
Yeah, I mean one to one, right? But but it won't be equal if I will wrap USDT and USDC, for example, because like it has a legal like difference in prices.
They're not wrapped together, each asset is wrapped individually.
So one asset is one XRC.
Yeah.
Ah, got it. I got it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess that part may not be clear. So like, XCRC20 is a more addressable, more easily like discussable name for EIP 7281. And then EIP is just a generic token contract. So it's just an extension to ERC20. So it's not that every token becomes a single token implementation. It's that any existing ERC20 token can be upgraded to becoming ERC 7281.
Sorry for so many questions,
No,
because I'm like, I'm Web3 developer also from 2016. And also I'm trying to build a model in my head and also like to visualize it. So I understand it from this point, but how on the target chain I will be able like to unwrap these properties to any other properties.
So so the point here is that if you're a token issuer, so say you're a maker, right?
Yeah.
Right now, you don't own the canonical representation of your token on another chain. So like when a user goes and bridges DAI to Maker, the version of DAI that is minted on Maker is the Arbitrum bridged DAI, right? It's the one that the bridge contract actually controls. Now this is actually a problem with Maker. Like this is why they don't do this. Like Maker has their own bridging system internally because they realize that it's in the way that it works currently, like the Arbitrum bridge would own their tokens, there will be no way for them to modify like DAI supply.
I can ask the question differently. For example, I'm locking my liquidity like to wrap to XRC20 on the one chain. Who will give me this liquidity back on another chain? This wallet. For example, I'm doing like a breach of $1,000 on this chain. I receive XRC20 here. I'm reading it. I receive like, for example, XRC20 on Arbitrum. How can I swap it back like to my $1,000?
You don't swap it back. You get the canonical token. So
It's canonical token that who defines the price of this token? The liquidity token.
It's the canonical layer of the token, so you don't need to define a price, right? So,
Yeah,
so like it's the same as like when USDC goes and deploys USDCE, right? So
Yeah.
that's their own native version of USDC.
Yeah, but it's USDC. But I mean, it's only defined for the tokens that supported like by organizations, right? For example, USDT, USDC, and not for all the assets we currently have.
If you have a capacity to mint a token one-to-one between chains, and a crypto economic guarantee that will happen, then the price mathematically will be the same.
Understand. So this kind of model is working only for Arbitrum optimism and Polygon that's like using rollups, right?
No, it can work for any chain. Actually, it can work for any chain. Ideally, a chain with a canonical bridge, but it actually can work anywhere. There's no reason for it to necessarily be, like, the guarantee that you're making here, or that you're providing is just, you have to make, so at some point you have to make a base assumption on some communication mechanism between chains, right? Ideally, that is a canonical bridge. For cases where there isn't something like that, you're basically assuming that at least one of these bridges has capacity to mint and burn the tokens across chains and is reliable enough to do that.
Yeah, but what's the point? I'm afraid here that I won't receive my $1,000 back on another chain. That's why, because I don't trust other tokens to be definitely sure. I mean,
so the thing here is like, because this is a canonical asset and not a wrapped asset, you basically like your duration of risk extends for the period of time that your transaction is in flight, right? So like the few minutes that is in process. When it arrives, it's not like other wrapped tokens where now you hold an asset that could become part similar to DLN, for example. If DLN gets hacked while your transaction is in flight, you lose your funds. If DLN gets hacked after your transaction arrives, you don't lose funds because you have the right asset. You done the swap.
Yeah, but it's you see on another chain. For example, the line works like that. So there is taker and vector, you are creating.
DLN works the same way as Connext, by the way. We actually, DLN is exactly what Connext used to do in 2021. Which is this.
Yeah, that's
Most
the problem.
instances.
Yeah.
Most instances.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like they're more like a trading platform.
Intense.
Yeah, but yeah, sorry for
No, it's these are good questions, actually. Like this is
I'm
important.
just trying to solve it, and so for example, I'm reading $1,000 on ETH, and I want to receive $1,000 on Polygon. How can I do it with XERC20? Okay, here I'm dropping my $1,000, 1,000 USDC, for example, to XERC20. I'm bridging it to the Polygon, and on Polygon, how can I receive back my USDC?
So
$1,000.
basically, you go back to this one. So let's say this is not wrapped staking. Let's say it's USDC, right?
Yeah.
You lock canonical USDC on Ethereum to create the XERC20 version of USDC. By the way, this whole part of the code is like completely abstract and user. Then you pick a bridge that you want to actually bridge through. If this could be Next, it could be DLM, it could be Layer 0, it could be the Polygon canonical bridge, doesn't matter. All of those bridges have the rights to mint USDC up to a certain amount. The canonical USDC on Polygon.
Yeah, but they do not.
They do. That's what the XERC20 model
I
does.
mean, DLN not. It just provides
I know that DLM is a little bit different.
But yeah, it provides you like the real USDC. The valuable USDC.
But this is the real USDC.
Yeah, it's strange, but how can I reveal like XERC20 to USDC on that side if I lost it here? So you have liquidity on the other side, right, to provide it to me?
No, this is just, you're just minting the token. That's the point that I'm making. So let's take another example, right?
Yeah.
Circle CCTV. Circle CCTV actually is exactly what XERC20 does, except it's using Circle's backend, right?
Yes.
How does Circle CCTV work? Circle allows any number of bridges to mint and burn USDC across chains. So on Ethereum, you send tokens into Circle's API. Like the bridge basically does this. It burns the USDC on Ethereum. Then you create an API request to Circle to complete the transaction on Polygon. You send that API request to them. After about 20 minutes, Circle gives you the rights to mint USDC on Polygon.
Correct.
Then you get the official version of USDC on Polygon.
Is there a reach here?
Pardon?
Is there a reach here with the token?
That's how they do it. And so in this case, with Wrap-Stakey, Lido is the issuer. Lido is basically giving you permissions for up to X amount of dollars of minting rights.
Yeah,
for every bridge.
so we will use USDC canonical bridges for that.
Or
to provide the liquidity from Ethereum to Polygon. So because like someone should give me $1,000 on another chain, right?
I was just using USDC as an example, but yeah, like using Wrap-Stakey as an example, Lido is giving you minting rights to be able to, like giving bridges minting rights to be able to mint a certain amount of Wrap-Stakey.
Yeah, I mean, but minting assets actually doesn't worth anything until you go bridge it back and also reveal your USDC that you love.
That's not true. But today, when you take your, let's say, XYZ token, right, and you bridge it from Ethereum to Optimism, and it goes to the Optimism bridge, the Optimism bridge mints XYZ token.
Yeah, but it's a optimistic bridge. I'm about your solution.
But it doesn't, what I'm saying here is that it's bridge agnostic completely. Like, it doesn't matter what the security model is under the hood here.
So
like, this is meant to be a way to keep this, basically allow for any number of bridges to be able to interact with the token and to incentivize ongoing competition on it.
So you're using other bridges as well? I mean,
The standard does, yeah.
okay, I get it.
So the idea is like the EIP is sort of a completely agnostic thing. So a good example is like BP, as I mentioned earlier, right? BP went live with their own XRC20 recently. What they did was they're actually not even using text. It's very interesting. they worked with us to set up the XRC20 token, but they already had established like business relationships with Layer 0, Axelar, and Chainlink. And so Layer 0, Axelar, and Chainlink are able to mint a certain amount of EV tokens across chains. Users can bridge EV tokens between chains using any of those three systems. They obviously all have slightly different security considerations, but they all have rate limits as well. And so the maximum amount of EV that's losable, I think, is like 50,000 CP or something like that per day.
Yeah, but I think that rough tokens is already the past because of the liquidity bridges tax and also liquidity providers tax. For example, for Curve being hacked, but they covered it. So,
Sure.
yeah, but it was like the liquidity is always like a potential target of hacker,
Yes.
of any hacker. So
100%.
no one system is secure, right?
100%. That's why in this model, there is never any liquidity locked in any bridge ever. It's only ever locked in a left contract.
Yeah, but someone should transfer this liquidity from this chain to this chain to balance it and return me in the target chain.
No, I mean, because you're just burning and minting the token, there's no like rebalancing either.
Yeah, but how it will worth $1,000?
Because you know you can use that to be able to unlock $1,000 from this lockbox at any time.
So I need to unlock it in my first chain where it's in, right?
Or you can acknowledge the fact that this, if it is always able to be used to unlock for $1,000, and if every DeFi application that uses, so say this is like Arbitrum, right? If every DeFi application uses the XRC20 version of wrap stake ETH on Arbitrum, then you know that that wrap stake ETH is worth intrinsically itself.
Yeah, now I understand. It works like base breach. For example, how they breached Ethereum base. You needed to log into the smart contract your Ethereum, and they unlock and they minted to your Ethereum on the base chain.
Yeah.
So actually, you locked your liquidity on Ethereum, and it left there. You locked.
Yeah.
Actually, they own your liquidity.
Yeah, and in this model, base bridge doesn't own it. It's so obviously this doesn't work with ETH, but for other tokens, right? Base bridge doesn't own the tokens. The tokens are actually locked somewhere else, not into base. And then the token issuer is the one that mints this token.
Yeah, absolutely, but they still own your money.
No, they don't. Like, there's no token locked in the base bridge in this case.
On base breach, no, but on Ethereum, yes. I mean, because to transfer your token, your ETH from Ethereum to base, you need to log into smart contract. So once you put one Ethereum on smart contract on Ethereum, you receive one Ethereum on the base because they are linking to you. So, but they own your one Ethereum. For example, if base...
When you say they, you mean base, right?
Yeah, base, the chain.
Yeah.
Because there's
So in this model, no one owns, I mean, do you mean base the chain because they could do whatever they want with the chain and then potentially?
Yeah.
Well, that's the guarantee that rails provide, right? It's like, technically speaking, there is a foolproof way, no matter what happens, to be able to exit that money out of the base bridge, technically.
Yeah, but you can't breach it back. I mean, there is a delay, like for a week and something like that. Yeah, there is, like a certain point that can make your money in danger. That's what I'm afraid, like for any person.
But this solves that, right? Because you're basically, you no longer need the base bridge to build the bridge to support the asset.
Yeah, but you still lock your $1,000 into the smart contract.
Into a lockbox.
Yeah.
Which is not the bridge.
But it's smart contract. Lockbox.
I mean, you're locking it into a smart contract, but if you're able to unlock it at any time using an XRC20 representation, and that XRC20 representation can be bridged through some bridges, at least instantly across chains, then you don't have to set up the exit window.
Yeah, but there is risk. I mean, definitely, yeah.
There's risk in any kind of bridging.
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, the optimal solution is for us to turn this piece into a public vision. Right? That's something that we're working on. But unfortunately, until that happens, we have to do things at the top of this full stack to make it so that projects don't fully get locked into only one system forever. And that's kind of the goal here. Is we're working towards improving the security. Over time, as people build better security models, we want to allow for token issuers like Lido or Maker or potentially others. We want them to be able to have the option to switch to better bridges.
Yeah, absolutely. But I believe in P2P trading, not the liquidity trading.
Yeah. I mean, there's no liquidity in our system. But
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, it works really to research DLN because I think really that they created something interesting by providing P2P trading actually. Because there is taker and maker, you're just the order group. cross-chain order book, like in the
I'm
messaging.
very, very familiar with that.
Yeah. So, like you're creating an order and someone will took this order because they can decrypt in another chain. But they, like, can claim this order, like, can steal it and receive it on another chain, and they cannot. So you're like, can jump from chain to chain, like if you find, and you're receiving props for that.
The only difference between DLN and what I'm describing here, so DLN is an intent execution system, right? DLN needs some settlement there. How does DLN settle? DLN settles basically by unlocking liquidity back on the source chain. So as an order taker, you're
They
receiving.
don't have liquidity.
Well, you unlock the trade on the source chain, right? So if I send ETH on Ethereum and then you want it to go to Optimism, then the liquidity provider, or basically the trader, trades with you by giving you ETH on Optimism and then getting ETH on Ethereum.
There is like an escrow where the escrow is a smart contract that distributes this liquidity. So once both smart contracts receive it, it distributes back to the target address.
This is actually exactly how our system works, except instead of the users receiving funds on the source chain, they receive it on the destination chain. So if you're an LP, you don't have to rebalance it.
Yeah, I got it.
It's the same system.
I just can't understand why do you need to wrap token.
Because in order for DLN to exist, so say DLN wants to swap tokens between like XYZ asset between Optimism and Polygon.
Yeah.
But XYZ asset doesn't exist on Polygon.
Yeah.
How does DLN do that?
Yeah, but you don't need. Why do you need to swap to bridge your XYZ to another chain if it doesn't exist there?
Well, what if the team wants to bridge it there because they want to use it for staking on Polygon?
Yeah, but if it doesn't exist, how do you do staking, right?
That's exactly the point, right?
Yeah,
That's exactly what this enable is.
Yeah, but I can't understand. So, for example, I have a company, right? I have working like XYZ on the one chain. And also, why do I need to go to another chain if this token doesn't exist there?
If you are say you're a project that is building a staking system, and your project exists on Arbitrum, Optimism, and Polygon, you want to enable your staking system to exist on all those chains, but your token only exists on Ethereum. And say Polygon doesn't have the US bridge, right? Even if it does have the US bridge, how do you get it there in the first place for anything? You have to bridge it. You have to create a representation of it. So then who owns that representation?
I mean, but there is like their own bridges for that. I mean, they
but their own bridges are minting representation, and they control that representation forever.
Yeah, I mean, the one doesn't have a liquidity cost. So, for example, if you
I get that, but I'm not even talking about the other. I'm talking about like how do you even like in order to swap between two assets, if that asset doesn't exist on another chain, how do you even get it there in the first place, right?
I mean, why do I need to rough test it on another chain if I want to write an original one? I mean, I have ETH, I have USDC. Why do I need rough USDC if it doesn't worth anything, right?
It's absolutely still worth something if you bridge it to another chain.
Yeah, but I want to swap these tokens between other persons. For example, you have $1,000 on other chain, on Polygon, for example. I have $1,000 on Ethereum, for example. I'm creating an order to swap. You see that? It's
but
not
that's a very limited use case, right? I'm talking about like if in the specific case of I'm a project and I want my project token to exist on another chain. How do I get it to that chain? You have to have a representation of the asset.
Yeah, I mean,
You have to, fundamentally.
but you, as an organization, you will deploy your own smart contract on it with limited supply of it, and you will provide.
Exactly. So if you are a token issuer today, deploying your own token to another chain, that technically you cannot, it's not actually possible to do that in a way that works with non-converters today. And until XRC 20 comes along, right now what happens is you don't deploy the token yourself.
I mean, it's like,
You get a bridge to deploy it for you, and then that bridge owns the token.
have you heard about Merit Circle, for example, how they need bridges? They need, for example, an asset on Ethereum firstly. After that, they burned it on Ethereum, like limited supply, and minted it on the BNB chain.
Yes.
And after that, they currently have like their own Avalanche subnet. So they're burning all their tokens on Ethereum and BNB chain and mint it on the
And what are they using as the message transport to burning this token?
Yes, but it's only like one.
Are they doing that custodially themselves?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's a problem, right? Like, that's not permissionless bridging, that's them custodially doing it themselves. So technically, you're trusting them to mint the correct amount and to not steal.
Yeah, but they're supporting their own project, so if they won't
Sure.
decide to deploy their own staking contracts, you can stake their tokens on another chain.
If Maker today could decide to arbitrarily burn, like as a DAO, right? Or it just, if it was possible for someone without any governance process whatsoever to arbitrarily burn a significant portion of DAI and then bring it to another chain, but when they bring it to another chain, they mint a different amount, would that be a trustless system?
Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for taking so much time.
This is a good line of questioning, by the way, and I'm
You're
right to be thinking about this, because this weird design space around bridges and around liquidity is why we are in this really shitty position right now, where the bridges keep getting hacked and where you have to pay a lot of money for it.
Yeah, I'll come to you after that to continue the discussion. Thank you very much.
Yes, this problem spaces. My brain is like melting. I assume you don't approve at all what happened with Lido and Layer 0 recently, right?
I mean, I think it's totally okay for people to go and permissionlessly deploy token representations on other chains. The part that I think is problematic is marketing those representations out.
Okay, that's normal narrative that people were criticizing it for. That's stupid, obviously, they corrected it. But it goes against the principle that you shared that it should be canonical, right?
Yeah.
So my question is about how do you reconcile the permissionless nature of what they did with your mission, let's say?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
So I actually think that these things are not opposites. Like, the fact that Layer 0 went and permissionlessly deployed the token and there was so much support for it indicates that there's clearly a market for it, right? And that should be possible. And in the future, it should be the case that as the DAO, you have to go through this ridiculous DAO process in order to get a version of the token somewhere. That is not incongruent with this option. In fact, this approach actually makes that more possible. Because the challenge with permissionlessly deploying tokens to other chains, otherwise, is that every bridge then goes and permissionlessly deploys the representation. Exactly. So what you can do instead is just make it so that bridges, by default, like as a communal standard, just deploy this representation.
Right, but
and then if they do that,
it just requires Layer 0 not to be part of the consortium, and then it's working, right?
yeah, but as long as we sort of, if we create the general sort of communal standard that that's the point here. I mean, if you create the communal standard that the DAO is the one that decides the canonical token, which they do currently anyway, right? Yeah.
Well, in this case, they did. Yeah.
I mean, they did. Those tokens are not canonical, and Lido has really pushed back on it.
Right. People will use it, you know.
People will use it, but then when Lido goes and deploys their own version of the token and goes to incentivize liquidity for them, then people are gonna have to switch. And they're gonna have to bridge back, and it's gonna be a giant pain, right? That's it. And it's like the same thing as things like Moonbeam, where it's if you don't have anybody explicitly saying this is the correct version of the token, people will go all over the place for sure. So to your point, the right option, at least in my mind, is allow for users and bridges and projects to permissionlessly mint tokens on new chains. I think that is 100% needs to be the case, especially if people want to expand to many, many thousands of rollups. There's no other way to make it work. But by default, just deploy a neutral standard rather than a vendor model, right? And that feels like it's somewhat uncontroversial, where it's you shouldn't make an assumption that Lido will support only your bridge or anything like that. But it's fine to say okay, there's an official version of the token, and our official version is agnostic.
Right. Although people were doing that for Uniswap and they were trying to get the bid with winning the specific.
Yeah. I mean, I think in Layer 0's case, it's just that they wanted to pressure the DAO into accepting that as the official token, which
it's the permissionless way. No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's these things are really important, right? Permissionlessness, trust minimization are really important, and sometimes they do come in conflict with each other. And this is one of those instances where it's anyone can permissionlessly deploy, scammy tokens. But then when you market them as the official versions, then that's when it becomes a problem. It's making sure that user expectations are very clear. So if users understood, hey, this is a version of the token that has not really been endorsed by the Lido DAO, there's potentially going to be another version of the token in the future, and you can absolutely bridge it and start doing things with this, but there may need to be a migration later. That would be completely fine, in my opinion.
Well, Lido would still take it.
Okay, for Lido, there's a reason why a lot of people were suggesting because they were just like, yeah, like, just deploy the S6, like, film it around. Sorry.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
Thanks so much.